In an age before GPS, Google Maps, or even detailed road signs, how did people navigate vast distances across continents? Imagine traveling hundreds of miles without a single map to guide you. In the Middle Ages, maps were rare and often inaccurate, reserved only for the wealthy and educated. Yet, despite these challenges, people managed to traverse Europe, Asia, and Africa with remarkable precision. How did they do it? Today, we'll uncover the secrets of medieval navigation, from natural landmarks and celestial bodies to oral traditions and local knowledge. The journey begins with one simple question. How did medieval people find their way without modern technology? From rivers and stars to ancient stone markers and well-trodden paths, every element of the environment played a role in helping travelers navigate. Whether you're exploring the bustling trade routes of the Silk Road or following the footsteps of pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago, this story will reveal how humans adapted to survive and thrive in a world without maps. Forget everything you know about road signs or digital navigation. In the Middle Ages, nature itself was your map. Without modern tools, travelers relied on rivers, mountains, forests, and even the shape of the land to guide their journeys. Imagine walking for days with no written directions, only a mental image passed down by word of mouth. A traveler might be told, follow the river until you see the hill shaped like a dragon's back, then turn east. These natural features were more than just scenery, they were lifelines. Rivers were among the most important guides. They offered both direction and sustenance. Major waterways like the Rhine or the Danube became highways for merchants, pilgrims, and armies. Follow the current long enough, and you'd eventually reach a town or village. The same principle applied across continents, from an island in Africa to the Silk Road in Asia, where oases and mountain passes dictated movement. Mountains also played a crucial role. Their silhouettes could be seen from great distances, serving as fixed points in an ever-changing landscape. Travelers memorized which peaks marked the edge of a kingdom or signaled a dangerous pass. Forests, too, were both obstacles and markers. Dense woods meant slower progress, but clearings or unique trees, like an ancient oak or a grove shaped by wind, could serve as meeting points or directional clues. Even the stars above were part of this vast, unwritten map. At night, Polaris, the North Star, gave a constant reference point. During the day, the sun's position helped determine direction. For those who knew how to read it, the world itself was a guidebook. Maps were rare, expensive, and often inaccurate, but knowledge? That traveled fast. In medieval times, the most valuable navigation tool wasn't made of parchment or ink. It was passed from mouth to ear, from village to village, from traveler to traveler. Before you set out on a journey, you didn't grab a guidebook. You found someone who had already been there. A local elder, a merchant returning from trade, or even a wandering monk could offer vital details. The bridge near Lincoln is washed out in spring, or don't sleep near the forest after dark. Wolves come down from the hills. This oral tradition was more than just helpful advice. It was survival training. Travelers memorized routes by listening to stories filled with landmarks, dangers, and safe places to rest. These weren't vague directions like, turn left somewhere past the hill. They were vivid, memorable tales that painted a mental map in your mind. Imagine sitting by a fire in a small village, listening to an old man describe how he crossed the Alps as a boy. When the path narrows and the wind screams through the rocks, follow the sound until you see the pine tree leaning west. That's where the trail turns uphill again. Those words stuck with you long after the fire burned out. Pilgrims heading to holy sites often carried these stories like heirlooms. Some even wrote them down in personal journals, creating early versions of travel guides. But for most people, especially the poor and illiterate, spoken word was their only source of information. Local guides were invaluable. If you couldn't afford one, you begged, bartered, or borrowed their knowledge. Sometimes all it took was offering a few coins, a meal, or helping carry supplies in exchange for safe passage. The best guides knew every shortcut, every ford across a river, and every town where strangers were welcomed or warned away. Even language wasn't always a barrier. Traders and travelers developed simplified dialects, hand signals, and gestures to communicate across borders. You didn't need to speak the same tongue to understand a raised finger pointing east or a nod toward the mountains. In this world without maps, memory became the greatest tool. And those who mastered it, who could recall every twist in the road, every warning whispered in the dark, were the true navigators of the Middle Ages. If you wanted to travel safely in the Middle Ages, there was one surefire way: follow the pilgrims. These long-established routes were some of the most reliable paths across Europe, used by thousands of travelers every year. Whether heading to Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem, pilgrims followed roads that had been walked for centuries. These routes weren't just popular, they were lifelines. Unlike unmarked wilderness trails or dangerous backroads, pilgrimage paths were well-worn, often maintained, and filled with fellow travelers. More importantly, they came with infrastructure: hostels, hospitals, chapels, and even early forms of roadside inns. Imagine setting out on a journey with nothing but faith and a rough plan. You wouldn't go alone. Pilgrimage groups formed naturally: merchants, monks, knights, and common folk all walking together for safety. There was strength in numbers, especially when crossing mountains, forests, or lands ruled by rival lords. One of the most famous routes was the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. Stretching across northern Spain, it was a magnet for European travelers. Along the way, stone markers and scallop shell symbols guided the way. Villages sprang up around these paths, offering food, shelter, and spiritual guidance. But pilgrimages weren't just about religion. They were also escape routes. Criminals fled justice by claiming to be pilgrims. The sick sought cures at holy shrines, and the poor found work guiding or serving those who passed through their towns. Even if you weren't religious, following a pilgrimage route was one of the safest bets for medieval travel. It meant company, protection, and a clear path forward, something not many could afford to ignore. In a world without maps or road signs, religion offered more than just spiritual guidance. It provided direction. Churches, monasteries, crosses, and even statues became crucial landmarks that helped travelers navigate vast distances. Imagine walking through an unfamiliar land where no written signs exist. What do you look for? Smoke rising from a chimney? A bell ringing in the distance? In medieval Europe, the answer was often simple: follow the church spire. Towering above villages and towns, church steeples were visible from miles away. They marked the center of every settlement, making them easy to spot on the horizon. For pilgrims and merchants alike, these structures weren't just places of worship. They were waypoints in an otherwise unpredictable journey. Monasteries played a similar role. Scattered across the countryside, they were strategically built near rivers, mountain passes, and major trade routes. Monks not only prayed and studied, but also served as hosts to weary travelers. Many monastic communities offered food, shelter, and medical care, some of the earliest forms of roadside hospitality. Even smaller religious markers mattered. Stone crosses carved with prayers stood at crossroads, warning travelers of dangers ahead or offering blessings for safe passage. Statues of saints, sometimes placed along paths or at village entrances, gave reassurance that divine protection was near. These symbols weren't just helpful, they were trusted. In times when strangers were viewed with suspicion and bandits roamed the roads, arriving at a church or monastery meant safety. Travelers could rest without fear of being robbed or harmed. This reliance on religious architecture wasn't limited to Christianity. Across the Islamic world, minarets guided caravans through deserts and cities alike. Buddhist stupas marked sacred sites along pilgrimage routes in India and Southeast Asia. In each case, faith shaped the geography of travel. So next time you see an old stone church standing alone in a field, remember, it might have once been the difference between life and death for a lost traveler in the Middle Ages. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the roads became too dangerous to travel, one place offered warmth, food, and a roof over your head: the inn or tavern. These roadside stops were more than just places to rest. They were hubs of information, safety, and community for medieval travelers. Imagine walking for miles under the scorching sun or through freezing rain, your boots worn and your stomach empty. The sight of smoke rising from a chimney or the glow of candlelight behind wooden shutters was like spotting an oasis in the desert. That meant shelter, and more importantly, survival. Inns and taverns dotted the major roads of Europe, especially along pilgrimage routes and trade paths. Some were simple cottages with a few beds, while others were sprawling complexes offering stables, meals, and even protection from bandits. The best ones had reputations that spread far beyond their villages, known not just for good food, but for trustworthy hosts. These establishments played a crucial role in medieval navigation. Travelers who had never seen a map relied on word-of-mouth directions from innkeepers. The next town is 2 days east, they might say, or avoid the forest after dusk. Wolves have been coming close. Many inns also displayed signs with images instead of words, helping illiterate travelers recognize them from afar. But inns weren't just about direction. They were centers of news and culture. A traveler could hear stories from distant lands, learn about wars, royal decrees, or even find work. Merchants struck deals over tankards of ale. Pilgrims shared prayers and songs. And sometimes, a wandering minstrel would entertain the crowd with tales of dragons, knights, or lost love. Of course, not all inns were safe. Some were run by thieves who drugged their guests and stole their belongings. Others charged exorbitant prices for poor quality food and thin straw mattresses crawling with fleas. But for most travelers, staying at an inn was worth the risk. Better than sleeping under the stars where wolves, wild animals, or worse, human predators, lurked in the dark. For those who couldn't afford a room, even the stable provided warmth and shelter. Straw-covered floors, the scent of hay and horses, and the soft snoring of oxen made for a surprisingly comforting bed. It wasn't luxurious, but it kept you alive until morning. So next time you see a weathered sign swinging above a doorway, remember, in the Middle Ages, it might have been the only thing standing between you and the wilderness. In a world without maps, roads, or signs, medieval travelers didn't just rely on stars or stories. They watched the animals. Long before modern navigation tools existed, people followed the natural instincts of creatures who knew the land better than any human ever could. Imagine walking through dense forest with no clear path ahead. You've heard rumors of a village 2 days east, but there's no road, no markers, only trees in every direction. What do? You look down. Animal tracks told medieval travelers everything they needed to know. A trail of deer hoofprints might lead to water. A line of ants marching across the forest floor could signal dry ground. Even birds flying at dawn often pointed toward open fields or rivers. Travelers learned to read these signs like a book. If wolves howled from one direction, that meant danger. Avoid it. If foxes were seen moving steadily along a ridge, that likely marked a safe route. Herds of wild boar often carved out trails so deep and worn that even humans began using them. This wasn't just guesswork. It was survival training passed down through generations. Hunters, shepherds, and scouts studied animal behavior as carefully as modern pilots study flight charts. They memorized which animals traveled where, when, and why. A shepherd might follow sheep paths over mountains, knowing the flock always chose the easiest route. Fishermen tracked bird migrations to locate fishing grounds. Traders in desert regions followed camel herds, trusting their instincts to find hidden oases. Even weather patterns were predicted by wildlife. If birds flew low, rain was coming. If insects swarmed thick around your head, a storm was near. Travelers who ignored these signs often paid the price, lost, stranded, or caught in the elements with no shelter. Of course, not all animal guidance was helpful. Some paths led into dangerous territory. Wolves, bears, and snakes had their own routes, and following them too closely could be deadly. But for those who understood the language of nature, animal tracks were among the most reliable tools for navigating the unknown. So next time you're lost in the woods, or just trying to find your way through life, remember, sometimes the best guide isn't a person. It's the animals. In a world without maps or compasses, medieval travelers looked up for direction. The stars and the sun were their greatest allies, offering a reliable way to navigate even in unfamiliar lands. Imagine walking through an open field at night with no roads, no signs, and no buildings in sight. What do? You look to the heavens. Long before the invention of modern navigation tools, people learned to read the sky like a book. And in the Middle Ages, that skill could mean the difference between reaching your destination or vanishing into the unknown. The North Star, Polaris, was the most trusted guide. Unlike other stars, it appears fixed in the sky, always pointing north. Travelers memorize how to find it by locating the Big Dipper constellation and following its 2 outer stars to Polaris. This simple trick allowed them to maintain direction even when all else failed. During the day, the sun played a similar role. Its position in the sky helped determine east and west. At noon, when the sun was highest, travelers knew they were facing south in the northern hemisphere. Some even used shadow sticks, planting a small pole in the ground and watching where the shadow fell to estimate direction. Sailors relied heavily on celestial navigation, especially during long voyages across dangerous waters. They used tools like the astrolabe and cross staff to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. These devices, though crude by today's standards, gave experienced navigators a surprisingly accurate sense of latitude. But not every traveler had access to instruments. Most relied on memory and experience. A merchant moving goods from one town to another would learn the positions of key stars and how they aligned with known routes. Pilgrims heading to holy sites often followed the same paths year after year, using the sky as a silent but steady guide. Even animals understood this system. Birds migrating seasonally followed celestial cues, and some travelers watched their flight patterns to confirm their own direction. Owls, bats, and nocturnal insects also moved according to the stars, reinforcing what medieval people already knew. The sky never lied. Of course, cloudy nights or stormy days could throw everything off. But those who mastered celestial navigation rarely found themselves truly lost. They built mental maps of the sky, matching constellations with landmarks and terrain features. So next time you complain about getting lost without GPS, remember, centuries ago, people traveled thousands of miles guided only by the light of the stars. No GPS, no maps, no signs, just the road ahead, and the mistakes of those who walked it before you. In the Middle Ages, experience was the only teacher when it came to travel. There were no guidebooks, no written directions, and no roadside assistance. Every journey was a gamble, and survival often depended on learning from the errors of others or paying the price for not doing so. Imagine setting off on a trip with nothing but second-hand advice and your own instincts. You might be told, turn left at the crooked tree, only to find that the tree was struck by lightning last winter. Or someone says, follow the river until you reach the next village. But after days of walking, all you find are wolves and an empty stomach. Many travelers learn the hard way that not every path led somewhere safe. Some roads ended in impassable mountains. Others led straight into enemy territory. And more than a few paths simply vanished in a forest where no one had gone for years. But mistakes weren't wasted. They became stories, warnings passed down around fires and in market squares. A merchant returning from a failed route might warn others, don't take the northern pass through the Black Forest. The bandits there don't just rob you, they leave you tied to a tree. These lessons were stored in memory, not books. Entire villages knew which roads were cursed by bad luck, not because of magic, but because too many people had died trying to cross them. Some towns even posted verbal warnings at crossroads, telling travelers what went wrong the last time someone tried that route. The most experienced guides weren't trained navigators. They were survivors. People who had made every mistake possible and lived to tell about it. Their value wasn't just in knowing the right path. It was in recognizing the wrong ones. Even kings and nobles, despite their wealth, relied on this trial-and-error knowledge. Royal messengers traveled faster, not because they had better maps, but because they had memorized the safest routes through years of near disasters. And if you were foolish enough to ignore these warnings, well, medieval history is filled with the names of those who didn't listen and never returned. While pilgrims followed holy paths and farmers walked familiar trails, merchants moved across continents, not with faith or tradition, but with goods. These traders formed the backbone of medieval travel, linking distant lands through vast trade networks that stretched from Europe to Asia. Forget everything you know about shipping packages overnight. In the Middle Ages, moving goods meant months of planning, risk, and survival. Yet despite the dangers, these routes were lifelines for economies, cultures, and even ideas. The most famous of these was the Silk Road, a sprawling web of land and sea routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. But it wasn't just silk that traveled this road. Spices from India, glassware from Venice, furs from Russia, and gold from Africa all flowed along these ancient highways. Without maps or GPS, how did merchants navigate such distances? They didn't go alone. Caravans, groups of traders traveling together, became the safest way to move goods. A single caravan could include hundreds of camels or oxen-drawn wagons, guarded by armed escorts. Safety came in numbers, especially when crossing deserts, mountains, or lawless regions where bandits waited in ambush. These caravans relied on a network of waypoints, cities, towns, and caravanserais, roadside inns built specifically for travelers. Some were simple shelters with stables, others grand complexes offering food, water, and protection. These stops weren't just places to rest. They were hubs of commerce and culture, where languages mixed, news spread, and deals were struck. Each route had its own dangers. The Sahara was a death trap without proper preparation. The Pamir Mountains, known as the roof of the world, challenged even the most seasoned guides. And pirate-infested waters made sea travel risky, though necessary for reaching coastal markets like Constantinople or Alexandria. Despite these obstacles, trade flourished. Merchants memorized every twist and turn of their routes, passing knowledge down through families and guilds. They learned which oases could be trusted, which rulers demanded bribes, and which roads were safest during monsoon season. And while they carried goods, they also carried stories, beliefs, and technologies. Islam spread westward along these paths. Papermaking techniques moved from China to Europe. Even the Black Death likely traveled via merchant ships and caravans. For those who mastered this world, wealth awaited. Successful traders could rise from humble beginnings to become powerful figures in society. But one wrong turn, one misjudged alliance, or one sandstorm could mean ruin, or worse. So next time you order something online and marvel at how fast it arrives, remember, centuries ago, people crossed entire continents just to bring spices to your table. While land travelers followed rivers, stars, and well-worn paths, sailors had an even greater challenge: navigating the open sea with no maps, no compasses, and no guarantee of return. Imagine standing on the deck of a wooden ship, surrounded by endless water in every direction. No roads, no landmarks, no signs. Just wind, waves, and the occasional seabird to suggest land might be near. This was the reality for medieval sailors who braved the oceans without modern navigation tools. Unlike today's GPS-guided voyages, medieval seafarers relied on instinct, experience, and observation. They studied the behavior of birds, the color of the water, and even the smell of the wind to determine where land might lie. A flock of gulls flying west at sunset could mean an island or coastline was nearby. Clouds forming over distant shores helped guide them home. One of the most trusted methods was coast hugging, staying close to shore so that if something went wrong, escape was always within reach. Sailors moved from one visible landmark to another, memorizing routes like inland travelers following rivers and mountains. This technique worked well for short trips across the Mediterranean or along European coasts, but it wasn't enough for longer journeys. For those venturing farther out, knowledge of tides, currents, and winds became crucial. Experienced sailors could read the way waves broke against the hull to judge depth and direction. They learned which winds blew where at different times of year, using this information to plan their routes months in advance. The sun and stars played just as important a role at sea as they did on land. During the day, the position of the sun gave direction. At night, Polaris, the North Star, remained fixed in the sky, offering a reliable point of reference. Viking navigators even used sunstones, special crystals that could locate the sun's position through cloud cover, giving them an edge in unpredictable weather. But perhaps the most valuable tool wasn't scientific at all. It was memory. Knowledge of safe harbors, dangerous reefs, and favorable winds was passed down orally from sailor to sailor. These unwritten guides were more trusted than any crude chart. Despite these skills, sailing in the Middle Ages was incredibly risky. Storms could appear without warning. Currents could drag ships off course. And once you lost sight of land, there was no telling whether you'd ever see it again. Yet despite the dangers, people sailed. Fishermen braved the waters for food. Merchants crossed seas to trade goods. Explorers sought new lands. And sometimes, entire fleets disappeared, swallowed by the unknown. So next time you board a boat, take a moment to appreciate the technology that keeps you safe, because not long ago, survival at sea meant trusting only the sky, the waves, and your own instincts. In a world without maps, modern trade laws, or even reliable roads, who kept the medieval economy moving? Who made sure that spices from India reached Venice, that wool from England made it to France, and that gold flowed across continents? The answer lies in the power of guilds, secret networks of merchants, craftsmen, and traders who held the keys to medieval commerce. Imagine trying to start a business today with no bank accounts, no contracts, and no internet. How do you protect your goods? How do you know whom to trust? In the Middle Ages, you joined a guild. Guilds were more than just professional groups. They were families, security forces, and law enforcement rolled into one. Each guild controlled a specific trade, like weaving, blacksmithing, or spice trading. They set prices, trained apprentices, and ensured quality. Most importantly, they protected their members from fraud, theft, and foreign competition. For merchants, guilds were lifelines. Traveling long distances meant passing through dangerous territories ruled by lords who could demand heavy tolls or simply confiscate your goods. Without protection, a single wrong move could mean ruin. But if you were part of a powerful merchant guild, you had leverage. You had allies. And most importantly, you had secrets. These secrets weren't magical spells or hidden treasure maps. They were knowledge passed down through generations. Which routes were safest, when to travel to avoid bandits, where to find trustworthy guides, and which cities offered fair treatment to outsiders. This information was guarded as closely as gold. Some guilds even built their own networks of safe houses and storage depots along major trade routes. These hubs allowed merchants to store goods, rest safely, and exchange news about dangers ahead. Think of them as the medieval version of secure shipping centers, only with fewer delivery trucks and more swords. One of the most powerful merchant guilds was the Hanseatic League, a confederation of trading cities stretching across northern Europe. From London to Novgorod, these merchants formed an economic empire that operated beyond national borders. They negotiated treaties, waged wars, and controlled prices across the continent. If you wanted to do business in the Baltic or North Sea regions, you either joined the League or you got left behind. But guilds didn't just control trade, they controlled people. Becoming a member wasn't easy. Apprenticeships could last years, and only those who proved their skills and loyalty could rise through the ranks. Some guilds even required initiations, oaths, and secret handshakes, not unlike modern secret societies. Of course, this system had its downsides. Guilds often acted like monopolies, keeping prices high and new competitors out. But for all their flaws, they provided structure in a chaotic world. Without them, medieval trade would have been nearly impossible. So next time you buy something online and marvel at how fast it arrives, remember, centuries ago, survival depended on a handshake, a sworn oath, and knowing exactly who to trust. In a world without street signs, road maps, or even consistent naming conventions for towns, how did medieval travelers know they were going the right way? They didn't rely on paper, they relied on stone. Long before printed directions or digital navigation, people carved their paths into history, literally. Milestones, boundary stones, and carved markers stood along roads, guiding merchants, pilgrims, and armies across vast distances. These weren't just decorative rocks. They were lifelines in an age where getting lost could mean death. Imagine walking down a dirt path that splits 3 ways. No signs, no helpful locals, just silence. What do you do? In medieval Europe, your best hope was spotting a stone with markings, perhaps Roman numerals, a symbol, or even a crude carving of a saint. These stones told you how far it was to the next town, which direction to turn, or even warned of dangers ahead. Some of the earliest and most reliable markers came from the Romans. Their empire had built thousands of miles of roads, each lined with milestones that showed distances in Roman miles. Though Rome fell, many of these stones remained standing long into the Middle Ages. Travelers followed them like breadcrumbs through a forest of uncertainty. But not all markers were ancient relics. Local lords, monasteries, and even kings commissioned new stones to mark territory, warn of tolls, or show safe passage. Some bore inscriptions like "To Canterbury, 12 leagues," or warnings such as "Beware the wolves after dark." These markers weren't limited to Europe. Across the Islamic world, caravanserai networks used stone pillars to indicate safe stops. In India, temple complexes often doubled as directional hubs, with reliefs showing nearby villages and distances. Even Viking settlements left behind runed stones that recorded journeys, battles, and trade routes. Of course, not every traveler could read. Literacy rates were low, especially among the poor and working class. But symbols helped bridge the gap. A cross meant a church or monastery was near. A crown marked royal land. A sword warned of danger. These visual cues became a silent language understood by all who traveled. And when the stones disappeared, whether from weather, war, or theft, confusion followed. Entire towns were known to argue over borders because no one could find the original marker. Some were stolen and repurposed for building materials. Others were moved or destroyed during conflicts. Still, those who knew how to read the landscape, both natural and man-made, had a huge advantage. They could travel farther, safer, and faster than those who wandered blindly. So next time you pass a highway sign without thinking twice, remember, centuries ago, finding your way might have depended on nothing more than a few carved letters on a lonely rock. Superstition wasn't just a quirky habit in the Middle Ages. It was survival strategy, warning system, and, sometimes, a death sentence. Imagine setting out on a journey with no compass, no written directions, and no way to predict the weather. What did people do when they couldn't rely on facts? They turned to omens, rituals, and stories passed down through generations. These weren't just bedtime tales. They were warnings carved into the very fabric of daily life. One of the most common beliefs was that certain animals could guide you. If a bird flew from left to right, it meant good luck. If a fox crossed your path at dawn, it warned of danger ahead. Ravens, often seen near battlefields and graveyards, were thought to be messengers of death, and no one wanted to see one before a long trip. Travelers also followed strict rules about what day to leave. Friday was considered unlucky for journeys, especially if you believed in Old Norse myths where Freya, goddess of fate, disapproved of travel on her sacred day. Some avoided starting a trip during certain phases of the moon, believing bad fortune would follow them all the way to their destination. Then there were the charms, tiny objects carried for protection. A piece of iron, a dried herb, or even a small bone might be tucked into a traveler's pouch to ward off evil spirits. Salt was believed to keep demons away, so many sprinkled it around their campfires at night. And if you had access to holy relics, even a scrap of cloth said to have touched a saint, you carried it like a modern-day passport. Folktales played a huge role in shaping how people moved through the world. Entire regions were avoided because of local legends. Forests were haunted by witches. Caves were home to dragons. Crossroads were meeting places for devils and cursed souls. Travelers didn't just avoid these places out of fear. They believed doing so could save their lives. Some superstitions were practical, disguised as magic. For example, avoiding travel after dark wasn't just about ghosts. It was about real dangers, bandits, wild animals, and getting lost in unfamiliar terrain. Covering mirrors in homes while traveling wasn't about spirits. It was a way to prevent strange reflections from startling someone in the dark. But not all beliefs were harmless. In some cases, superstition led to death. During times of plague or famine, entire villages blamed outsiders, strangers who looked suspicious or arrived from cursed lands. Witch hunts often began with someone claiming a traveler brought bad luck. And once accusations started, there was no escaping them. Even the church got involved. Priests blessed roads, bridges, and ships before long journeys. Pilgrims prayed at roadside shrines for safe passage. Some wore crosses not just for faith, but as armor against unseen forces. So next time you hear a creak in the dark and think it's just your imagination, remember, centuries ago, that sound might have been your only warning before something far worse found you. So here we are, at the end of a journey that never left the ground. We've walked through forests with no maps, followed stars across open fields, and trusted animals more than men. And yet, despite all these tools, medieval travelers had one final secret weapon. They remembered. In a world without paper guides or digital navigation, memory was the most powerful tool in your pack. The best travelers didn't just follow paths, they memorized them. They stored every landmark, every warning, every shortcut like treasure passed from generation to generation. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was spoken, sung, carved into wood, or stitched into legend. Some routes were guarded like family secrets. Others were shared freely, because even in the darkest ages, people understood the value of helping each other find their way. And if you think this is all ancient history with no relevance today, think again. Modern travel may be faster, safer, and filled with glowing screens, but we've lost something along the way. We no longer read the land. We don't listen to the wind. We don't trust our instincts as much as we used to. We follow directions without understanding where we're going. Medieval travelers didn't have that luxury. Every journey was a test of skill, endurance, and intelligence. They learned to see the world not as a series of points on a map, but as a living, breathing guidebook. So next time you pull out your phone and tap a few buttons to get somewhere, remember, not long ago, people did the same thing using nothing but the sky, the trees, and the stories they carried with them. And now that you've seen how they did it, maybe you could too. If you enjoyed this journey through the forgotten art of medieval navigation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss another adventure through history's greatest mysteries. Because sometimes the past holds the answers to the future.